Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, or my guest today is Michael Bungay Stanier. I will tell you all about Michael in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment that we care for others. And when you do it as a leader, as you will definitely discover that Michael is, you do it with sense of compassion to bring people together for common cause. Michael, welcome to
Thank
Grace
you.
Under Pressure.
I was listening to the theme song with my ukulele and knowing that you are a great piano player. I'm thinking we should just re-record it and do our own version of it. I have no talent as a musician. You have all the talent. So we'd have to do something in the post-production mix to make it work. But
it would be totally
It's nice to see
totally magic. I want to tell folks all about you because the reason you're here is you have a brand new book, How to Work with Almost Anyone. Yeah. But this is one of your many books. Your best known is The Coaching Habit, which is a best-selling coaching book, and I think is sold well over 1 million. Is it 1 million? Okay.
Yeah, like 1.2 million or something, which is
wow. You know, and you are the founder of a wonderful company called Box of Crayons, a learning and development company that's trained hundreds of thousands of people from companies all around the world. You are a native of Australia. You are a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and now you live in Toronto. Michael, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
John, thank you. You know, you and I had the pleasure of hanging out on the weekend together. We were in Nashville for a gathering of the Marshall Goldsmith 100 Coaches community. So how lucky am I to get to talk to you twice in 1 week? I feel like...
Well, thank you for that. And as viewers are in for a treat, because whenever Michael and I get together, I start laughing. I don't know if Michael does, but I do.
Because more than being an author, I really want to be a stand-up comedian. But I've done the research, and first of all, it's really hard to be a stand-up comedian. I mean, it's really hard. You know, if you're doing a LinkedIn Live and you make a joke every 5 minutes, people think you're a genius. If you're a stand-up comedian, you have to make a joke about every 35 seconds, or else people think you're a bit rubbish. So here's my way of being a stand-up comedian without actually needing to do the work. Because I'm fundamentally lazy, John. I mean, I know this is about grace, but I'm bringing laziness to grace.
Michael, the art of laziness. So anyway, so I'm going to just jump in with an obvious question, but I know you can run with it. We talk about best possible relationship. What do we mean by that? Or what do you mean by that? So.
Yeah, you know, it's very hard of the new book, How to Work with Almost Anyone. Our working relationships are such a big influence on not just our success, but our happiness. And you know this to be true. Just think of the times you've had a really good working relationship and what that brought you in terms of happiness and success. And then think of the times you've had a less than great working relationship, because we've all had those, and the impact that had on your happiness and success. But most of the time, John, we just cross our fingers and we hope for the best. You know, we're like, okay, please does this one with this person not suck? And I'd like people to take a more active role in actually shaping the working relationships they have with their key people, whether that's your team that you're leading, your boss, colleagues, collaborators, vendors, customers, clients, those key people. How do you build the best possible relationship? Not the best relationship, but the best possible relationship, because every relationship has potential. And how do you make the great ones even better? How do you make the solid ones really good? And how do you make the bad ones bearable?
Great. Well, you have a secret, if I will, something you call the Keystone Conversation. And I love in the book how you describe Keystone. How did that image come about, Michael?
Yeah, so the Keystone Conversation, this is the key action in the book, which is have a conversation about how you work together before you plunge into the work. Because the work is always calling you. It's always there. It's loud. It's shouty. It's shiny. It's important. It's urgent. It's all of that. And the temptation is always to get on with it, get the stuff done. But I want people to take a beat and look each other in the eye and go, look, how will you and I work best together so that we can do the best possible job on this work? An inspiration for the word, the keystone, in the Keystone Conversation, well, it comes from architecture, of course. People will know this. There's that image of an arch, and it curves inwards, and the keystone is what holds the two sides together, brings them together, and creates stability and firmness. In fact, over time, it becomes more stable and stronger. So that's really nice. But actually, John, in the world of biology and ecology, they've taken this idea of a keystone and moved it into the idea of a keystone species, a species that makes the whole ecosystem healthier, more resilient, better able to bear stress. The best example being when they reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone National Park in the US, and how the wolves started eating the elk, which had previously been kind of destroying the place. That fewer elk, more trees, more birds, more trees, better river, healthier river, more fish, more beavers. The whole ecosystem became more diverse, more resilient, more vital, more alive by having those wolves, those keystone species introduced.
That's an interesting concept. So the secret to a good relationship is wolf ecology. So
Exactly. So, like, if it's not going that well in your team, just lock everybody into a pen with some wolves, and I promise you, things will be different at the end of it. I'm not exactly sure how they'll be different, but things will be different.
that's great. Now, you have an interesting thing about building the keystone conversation. And the first thing would be amplify your best. So if you and I are working together, Michael, does that mean that you just praise me, or how does that work?
Well,
So
I couldn't do that with you, John, because it would just take too long. I'd be spending my whole time praising John Baldoni. I'm like, okay, we're all getting tired of this after a certain point. We've been going for 4.5 days without stop. But you're right. It's like, okay, so a keystone conversation, a conversation about how you work together rather than what you're working on. And I think there are 5 questions that you can ask as part of the arc of a keystone conversation. And the first one is this amplify question, which is, what's your best? And it's not just me praising you. In fact, it's an exchange of information. Because, John, I want to understand, when do you shine and when do you flow? Like, who are you at your best? What does that even look like? And notice it's not what are you good at, and it's not what are your strengths, and it's not what are your values, because all of those are either too abstract or too nitty gritty. It's like, when are you in the zone? When do you flow? When do people look at you and go, man, I can see John lighting up here? And I want to understand what that is for you. And I want you to understand what it is for me. And when you know what I'm like at my best, and I know what you're like at your best, we've already laid the foundation for a conversation that says, so how do we get most of that in the way that we work together so that we both bring our best to whatever the challenge is at hand?
I want to clarify here. This is conversation. It's not simply for a boss to employee or vice versa, but it's to anyone with whom we work. Am I correct in that, Michael?
Yeah. I mean, I think of it like this. If you think of your ecology, your own ecosystem of the key people who make success and make happiness work for you, well, who are they? And obviously, it's, if you're working in an organization, it's probably your boss. They will have an influence on that. Maybe some key people on your team. It might be that person in the other team over there who you have to collaborate with. Maybe somebody outside the organization, like a vendor or a client or somebody like that. But yeah, we all have our key relationships. How do we make them important? How do we give them? And these are the 3 attributes of a best possible relationship: safe and vital and repairable.
Cool. Now, there's something else, amplify, but there's something else that's called the steady question. Is that the how, or?
This is a conversation or an exchange of information about kind of the mechanics, the logistics of working together. Because we all have our ways of doing stuff. And they all seem pretty common sense to us because we've been doing them for 5 or 10 or 20, or in yours and my case, 135 years. We've just built up.
Sometimes it feels like it.
Yeah, exactly. I know what you mean. So I have a preference on how I communicate on Slack. I have a preference on how to-dos tasks are written in my Asana. So first of all, I want to tell you I use Asana. And then I want to tell you, look, when I'm working with my assistant, Claudine, I'm like, Claudine, I like my tasks to start with a verb. I learned this from David Allen, who wrote Getting Things Done. He says, like, make sure your tasks actually are action-oriented. They start with a verb. So when we started working together and we had the steady question, which are, what are your practices and what are your preferences? I was like, my preference is for when you're putting something in the to-do list for me, started with a verb. But it can also be something as simple as, what's your name? How do you prefer to be called? Like, as an example, I really don't like to be called Mike. There are probably 10 people on the planet who I like to be called Mike by, and they're my brothers and their families and my parents. That's the Mike world. Everybody else, I'm like, my name is Michael. Call me Michael. And, in these days, and this was probably new for both of us, learning that about communicating pronouns. Like a lot of people are like, why are we doing that, particularly of our vintage? But people have a preference. This is how I like to be seen. This is how I like to be heard. Because that's what we're getting at, John, which is if you want to work well with people, you want to be seen and heard for all that you are, and you want them to be seen and heard for all that they are. Because when that happens, you're building something terrific together.
Well, then a steady question would be emphasizing one's dignity and respect for that individual. Am I correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you and I are trading information around email rather than Slack, morning rather than evening, this is how I like feedback. What we're basically saying is, let me tell you how I work. So as much as possible, we can fit in with each other and we can discover how we're different and we can negotiate a way around that difference.
Right.
So
one of the things I like about your work is it reflects your personality, and you have a sense of whimsy and humor as well as wisdom to you. So the next two kind of go hand in hand. It's the good date question and the bad date question.
Yeah,
so
right.
Tell us about that, Michael.
So the key insight here is that patterns from the past will repeat again in the future. That's why they're called patterns. And even though when you think about past working relationships, different person, different time, different context, you're a different person. The thing is, those patterns will keep repeating again in the future. So don't ignore that, learn from that. So in the same way that the amplify question, what's your best, kind of says, let me just tell you who I am when I'm at my best. This kind of increases the context a bit and says, let me tell you what I'm like when I'm in relationship with other people. So the good date question is, what can we learn from past successful relationships? Because, John, if I'm working with you and you're like, Michael, when I've hired somebody like you before, let me tell you when it really went well. Let me tell you what I did. Let me tell you what they did. Let me tell you what I said. Let me tell you what they said. Let me tell you what I didn't do and I didn't say. Let me tell you what they didn't do and they didn't say. That is immensely helpful. That's really going to give me some big clues as to what I should be doing. And I want to do the same for you. And then the bad date question, you can guess it's the other side of the coin, which is like, what can we learn from frustrating past working relationships? Because if I go, John, look, let me tell you the time I had hired a leadership expert who was also a great piano player, who also looked really good in a hat, somebody like you, for instance. And when it was a disaster, this is what happened. This is what I did, and this is what they did, and this is what I said. And I want to give you all those clues because I'm like, it was a mess. And I would love not to have that mess again. So let me tell you explicitly how to avoid the mess.
Good. And the next question, the last one, I love it. It's the repair question. And what's good about it is it's inherently, there's the element, you're building this a positive, the amplify, the best building. And you did say good day, bad day, but not everything is perfect. So is it worth repairing?
Well, it might be worth repairing. But here's what I can promise. If you have a key working relationship, something that's important to you, at some stage, it will go off the rails because it always does. At a certain point, something gets dented, something gets cracked, something gets bent, a misspoken word, a misunderstood commitment, broken promise, a misinterpreted action. At some stage, something gets a little kind of rattled. And, when I'm writing this book, John, I'm doing a lot of research into the people who are experts in relationships. So people like Esther Perel and Terry Real and Dan Siegel and John Gottman, all these people have written classic books on what it takes to have a relationship that has longevity and resilience and vitality to it.
Right.
And one of the things that they kind of agree with across the board is great relationships have an ability to get repaired. And what they also notice is that for the most part, we're not that good at repairing relationships. We tend to kind of like go, and run away and pretend it didn't happen and hope that it just disappears. And it's true, particularly in work, I think. there's a way in which relationships self-heal to an extent
Mhm.
because they have to. We're busy and time, and if I'm your boss, you're working with me at least until you quit. So things repair, but they rarely repair back to the state that they were or
Right.
the potential that they have. But if you
Now,
actively repair, John, there's a chance that your relationship actually not only returns to where it was, but actually deepens and improves.
that's great. I think in some ways this would be very useful for in organizations that taking a step back of the conflict avoidance
Yeah.
syndrome, where we people bug us or situations bug us and we just kind of suck it up. But that can be harmful over time. So
For sure.
the keystone conversation is a strong building block on that. So
Yeah. I mean, conflict avoidance. I mean, I can see Olu coming in from Nigeria and Shushma coming in and another person coming in from New York just in the comments. And if you're listening, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you coming in from? Where are you listening from? But, my guess is that all the people who are listening to this now live and then watching it later, we've all got some extent of conflict avoidance because nobody loves conflict. Everybody's like, conflict, it's a bit messy, it's a bit hard, it's a bit confusing, it's a bit threatening. I feel a bit vulnerable. I feel under attack, or I feel like I'm on attack. And it happens to all of us. So an ability to repair, also to be preemptive, to keep it repairable, actually is one of those ways to make conflict actually work in organizations.
now, I know this book is How to Work with Almost Anyone.
Yeah.
And you and I at our meeting were talking, and we were joined by Lisa McLeod. And she said, I love that title and the almost. So, where did the almost come from, Michael?
Well, I just thought of you, John. I mean, there's a chapter called Who Are the Almost? And there's a list of about 10 people. And your name appears 3 times out of those 10, which is like, I don't know what that's about. But
Michael, I am honored.
well, people love this title. And I'd have to say this is probably one of the most immediately best titles I've ever come up with for a book.
It's
Because
a great
everybody laughs. Everybody kind of goes, oh my goodness. That feels like something I need because I need to improve some relationships. But I also there are some people who I'm like, that ship has sailed. That's never going to be a good working relationship. So there's a couple of levels to answer that question, John. One is to say, look, there are some people who it's probably really, really hard to build a better working relationship with. They might be, a sociopath. There's a lot of those in business, particularly there's some research on this. Sociopaths are about 1% of the general population, but at senior levels, they can increase to a much higher percent. I've seen 3%, I've seen 10%, I've seen 21% of senior leaders are sociopaths, which doesn't feel true to me. But there is something about sociopaths don't really have an interest or a capacity to build better working relationships. So there's one category of almost. It might be other people who are going through a thing like some version of mental illness or stress or something that makes it very hard to build a better working relationship. But my guess is everybody here goes, I know who my almost is.
Right.
This person and this person and this person. So I'm like, plus I couldn't write a book called How to Work with Anyone because I'd be lying. I can't promise that. But I reckon when you remove the people who are on your almost list, you can't work with them. That leaves a lot of other people that you can work better with.
Absolutely. Well, also, I think that it takes the pressure off because just as you were describing it, whether it be a sociopathic behavior, but people we just do not click with for whatever reason. And another term I know our friend Marshall Goldsmith uses the word uncoachable for people who simply are not interested in coaching or will not go through it. So, and the challenge I think that you're saying is don't waste your time with that. Is that what you're saying, Michael?
Well, I'm saying that every choice you make has prizes and punishments. So when you look at a key relationship, somebody who will influence your success and happiness, you have a choice. Do I try and actively build a best possible relationship with them or do I not? And those two outcomes, I'm not going to build a best possible relationship. I am going to build a best possible relationship. Each one of those two choices has both prizes and punishments, risk and reward around doing that. If you decide to build the best possible relationship, the upside is that you likely build a relationship that is safer and more vital and more repairable. You get to work longer together. You get more enjoyment from that. But what's at risk is that the conversation doesn't quite click, that you're being vulnerable and that vulnerability isn't reciprocated, that actually it's just a hard conversation that somehow lessens your status.
Right.
If you think about the people who you're like, I don't want to build that best possible relationship with, prizes and punishments. The prize is like, I'm not going to risk anything, so I stay safe, I maintain the status quo. But the cost of that is you never have the opportunity to take a tough relationship and make it better.
Great. This book is very, very accessible. And one of the reasons so accessible, you have wonderful stories. It's backed by research. It's easy to read. But there's something else that you do in your work, and I call it beyond the book, whatever it is, because there are exercises. And you even have some QR codes in here. What led you to do that, Michael?
Well, the work I'm trying to do is change people's behavior. And it's really hard it's hard to write a book. But then you realize it's easy writing a book compared to getting people to notice a book and buy a book. And then you realize it's hard getting
the easy part, Michael.
Yeah, but harder than people buying a book is then getting them to read the book, because I've got piles of books on my floor that I'm getting around to reading sometime soon. So you're right. The book is written in a way that feels very open and accessible, and short, so that people can perhaps get through the book. But if I'm trying to change their behavior, even if they read the whole book and love it, and I hope they do, and if you've read it, please leave a review on Amazon or somewhere that you love. That would be gratefully received. I need them to change their behavior. So there's downloads that people can get. They can download all of the 5 questions, so they've got those as a reminder for them. But I think what might be most useful is watching me role model a keystone conversation with somebody. So you can actually get this whether or not you have a book. bestpossiblerelationship.com is the URL. And you can just sign in there. You need to give us your email address, but then you get access to the downloads and this 25-minute video of me role modeling a genuine best possible relationship keystone conversation with a colleague of mine.
That's wonderful, because we get to actually see it. We see it read it in print, and then see it dimensionalized. So building up on that, so people will read your book and maybe go some of the exercises, but there's sort of the thing. What's my first step? Okay, how do I approach a colleague? Or I can see a boss doing it, but what if a colleague, without feeling like I walk up to you, Michael, and I go, here's, we're working together. Let me tell you about myself or whatever. Yeah. How do I get over that point of resistance?
Yeah. So, I think one of the things you're pointing to is this is a not particularly common conversation. So if you start going, hey, let's have this conversation, people going, what? What are we doing here exactly?
But Michael says it's okay.
Yeah, Michael says it's okay, which should be all you need. But in case you need more than that, here's how I think about it, John. I try and just make it as explicit and obvious and as easy as possible. So actually in the book, I actually have lots of little scripts for people to say, use this language or use your own variation on that language. But effectively, John, if I was starting to work with you, I'd go, John, we could have had this. We didn't have this conversation, but we could have had it. John, I'm excited to be on your LinkedIn Live and your podcast and speaking to your audience. Thank you. I want it to be as great as we can. So rather than just sending me through the questions, which you did beforehand, I'd just like to have a conversation, you and me, about how we will work together on this conversation before we get into the content. Because did you notice, John, that what you did is you got into the work? You're like, Michael, here are the logistics. Here's the link. Here's when I want you to sign in. Here are some of the questions that I might be asking you. So we immediately went into the doing of the conversation. But if I had a conversation with you and like, John, tell me when you're at your best as a host, what does that look like? Tell me when you've had a really great a guest on the show. What did they do? What did they say? What did they not do? What did they not say? And imagine if I said to you, John, Let me tell you about the podcasts that bring out the podcast hosts that bring out my best. They make me look smart and funny and useful, and I contribute to the audience. Let me tell you what brings out the best in me. We can have that conversation about how we work together before we jump into it. Now, I wouldn't have made a big deal about it. I would have said something really obvious, like, John, I'm really looking forward to the podcast. But before we jump into the what of it, I'd just love to hear what it would take for us to make this outstanding. How would we work together to make this maybe your best ever Grace Under Pressure episode? And then we're into the conversation.
That's great. So setting a ground set. And I think inherent in that too is, even though you were explaining to me, there's the element of reciprocity. It's here's how I'm at my best, but I want you to be at your best.
Yeah. The origin of this work, as I understand it anyway, comes from people like Peter Block. And when I learned this from Peter Block 30 years ago, the language he used was social contracting. Now, I don't really love social contracting as a phrase, because it's a bit abstract and it's a bit legalistic, and it has kind of references to philosophy as well that can be a bit confusing. But what I do think speaks to truth is the word contract, because a contract is an exchange of value. And this reciprocity, which is like, don't just ask the questions, but give the answers as well, is a really essential part of the give and take. Because what it is the two of you showing up as human with each other and going, let me tell you who I am as a human. Tell me who you are as a human, so we can be as human as possible and the best version of our humanity whilst we're doing the work that needs to be done.
Great. So what's the feedback you've had so far from folks about what the takeaway is? I know the book is just out, but you've had some advanced copies. And so what are you getting back from that, Michael?
I think the reminder that, because this is the heart of the message, which is have a conversation about how you work together before you plunge into the what. And then secondarily, be the person who reaches out. Because, it's very easy to go, well, this would be great. I wish somebody would do this to me. And somebody on the other side of your office is saying exactly the same thing. The other day somebody said to me, nobody likes to be the first to say hello, but everybody loves to be greeted. So the invitation is to be the person who greets, who reaches out, who starts this, who does the first version of this. Because when you do it, you become that tiny ripple that changes the way everybody works.
Be the example you want others to be. Live
exactly.
it. That's great. Well, we are racing along here, and but we have a given time frame. And as you know, Michael, because you are a three-time guest,
3 times.
And I think the first 3 time out of well over 200 guests. So
Thank you.
That's pretty special. So anyway, so special for me. So
and me too.
Thank you. I ask every guest a story about grace. Is there something you want to share, Michael?
Well, I've got a story, but before I tell it, I'd like you to tell me and everybody listening, how do you define grace? So we just got that context.
Mm-hmm. I define grace as the catalyst for the greater good. We do it, and when we act on that, it's about connection, big, it could be small, intimate, can also be transformative. And the many stories I've had, people have told me simple things or big things that changed their life-saving, life-transforming. So grace is all of those and more.
Yeah.
So
nice. So the story I would tell or point to now is it's actually in the book, and part of the reason I wrote the book. My dad died a couple of years ago, close to 3 years now. And as he was dying, he was back at home. We knew he had a terminal illness. I was back in Australia living in the house with mum and dad. Mm-hmm. And I facilitated a version of the Keystone conversation between the two of them, because I wanted to make sure they had the best possible relationship in the weeks or months that they had left, so that in a time of great stress and anxiety, and where nobody's having a good time, it's like, how do you best navigate that with some grace, with generosity, with an open heart? How do you avoid as much of the stress and the niggling and the bickering that can show up at times like this. And yeah, my parents were like, "This sounds like a terrible idea." They're like, "This sounds like the last thing we want to do." But I kind of, was persistent, and we nudged them into it. I nudged them into it, and I would point to that as a moment of grace for me.
Oh, that's wonderful. What a wonderful moment. And I know that I think I spoke to you, interviewed you from Australia when you were there and
That's right.
the first time. And so what a gift you gave your parents by your presence there. And I know that wasn't physically easy to get there, but you made it. So the new book is How to Work with Almost Anyone. And my guest is Michael Bungay Stanier.
Yeah.
Michael, it is such a pleasure to have you. How can people find you and the book?
So if you want to get those downloads and get that access to the free recording of the Keystone Conversation, bestpossiblerelationship.com is the website for that. If you want to review the book, I would love you for that. Thank you. If you want kind of more general stuff about me, mbs.works is my website there. And that's the portal to social media and other stuff as well.
Great. We will put that in the notes so people have it as reference. And again, Michael, such a pleasure to speak to you. And let's laugh some more for the rest of the day.
Thanks, John.
With that,